The late 1980s in the NBA were not for the faint of heart. Every night felt like a battle, every playoff series like a war that stretched far beyond the painted lines. And at the center of so many of those conflicts stood a 6-foot guard from Chicago who wore the jersey of the Detroit Pistons but carried the weight of a whole franchise on his shoulders. Isiah Thomas was not the tallest nor the strongest, yet he was the heartbeat of the Bad Boys. He was their captain, their strategist, and their emotional core. And while his brilliance brought Detroit 2 championships, it also left behind scars that never fully healed. For Isiah, rivalries were never casual. They were not simply about wins and losses. They were personal, often cutting so deep that time itself could not erase them. He smiled on camera. He shook hands in ceremonies years later, but beneath that charm lay memories of grudges he could never quite forgive. To understand Isiah Thomas is to understand those rivalries, the names that still echo whenever fans remember the roughest, most unforgiving era in professional basketball. Think of the greats who crossed his path. A young Chicago phenom who threatened to take his crown. A Los Angeles superstar who once felt like a brother until friendship turned into silence. A Boston legend whose brilliance on the parquet sparked a storm with one careless remark. Even men who wore the same Pistons jersey shared tension with him behind locker room doors. And then there was a mountain of muscle from the West whose single elbow left both a scar and a symbol of the cost of playing in that unforgiving league. This is not just a list of names. It is a journey back into the heart of the 80s, when basketball was as much about pride as it was about points. It is a reminder that victories can fade, but grudges often last a lifetime. So tonight we revisit those stories. We open the doors to old rivalries, and we ask a simple question: which men stood across from Isiah Thomas and became the rivals he could never truly forgive? Michael Jordan was not just another opponent for Isiah Thomas. He was the storm on the horizon, the rising superstar who threatened to sweep away the Pistons' hard-earned dominance. When Jordan first entered the league in the mid-80s, he was already a spectacle, soaring dunks, dazzling speed, the kind of talent that made fans across the league forget almost everyone else on the court. For Detroit, though, Jordan wasn't a marvel. He was a problem that needed a plan. That plan became infamous as the Jordan rules. It was more than a defensive scheme. It was a manifesto. Trap him on the baseline. Cut off his driving lanes. Deliver hard fouls before he could take flight. Make every possession a struggle, every basket a bruise. And under Thomas's leadership, the Pistons embraced it fully. The battles between Detroit and Chicago in the late 80s were raw and unrelenting. Series after series, the Pistons denied Jordan his ascent, and for a time, Isiah Thomas held the upper hand in this bitter rivalry. But power never stays still in the NBA. By 1991, the balance had shifted. Jordan and the Bulls had grown stronger, tougher, wiser. When the Eastern Conference Finals came, the Pistons were swept aside in 4 games, their dynasty crumbling under Chicago's surge. The final minutes of that last game remain one of the most controversial images in league history. Instead of offering congratulations, Isiah and several Pistons walked off the floor without shaking hands. To many, it was poor sportsmanship. To Thomas, it was pride refusing to bow to a rival who had taken everything. The fallout stretched far beyond that night. When the legendary Dream Team was assembled for the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, Thomas, despite his resume, was left off the roster. Whispers spread that Jordan had played a role in keeping him out. Though Jordan denied it, the suspicion only deepened the wound. For Isiah, the exclusion was more than a professional slight. It was a personal betrayal that seemed to confirm what he already felt, that Jordan and the league itself would never forgive the Pistons for standing in the way of his early glory. Decades later, when The Last Dance documentary revisited that rivalry, the emotions still lingered. Thomas defended his actions, insisting the walk-off reflected the standards of the era. Jordan, with his trademark intensity, made it clear he had not forgotten. Even through television screens, the tension was palpable, as if time had not dulled the edge of their disdain. In many ways, Jordan was the one rival Thomas could never quite forgive, not because of a single game, but because their conflict defined an era. It was pride against ambition, defiance against destiny. And in the end, the scars left by those battles still shape how fans remember the bad boys and their fearless captain. If Michael Jordan was the rival who tested Isiah Thomas's pride, then Magic Johnson was the one who broke his heart. Their story did not begin as enemies. In fact, it began with smiles, with warmth, with a friendship that seemed unshakable. The two guards, one from East Lansing, the other from Chicago, rose to the top of the basketball world with charisma and flair. They were photographed laughing together, sharing embraces before tip-offs, exchanging whispers courtside. To the outside world, they looked more like brothers than rivals. But the NBA has a way of turning bonds into fractures. By the late 1980s, the Pistons and Lakers were on a collision course. The 1988 Finals became an instant classic. Detroit pushed Los Angeles to 7 games, only to fall short on the road. A year later, the Pistons returned the favor, sweeping the Lakers in 4 straight, lifting their first championship trophy as confetti rained down. Thomas and Magic hugged before the series, but by the end, something had changed. The intensity of competition had begun to chip away at the foundation of their friendship. Then came the turning point, a moment that transformed closeness into distance. In the early 90s, when Magic announced he was stepping away from basketball due to illness, the league rallied around him. Yet rumors swirled, some whispered in locker rooms, some hinted at in the press. Isiah was accused of being one of the players who cast doubt and spread damaging speculation. Whether or not those words were truly his, the damage was done. For Magic, it felt like betrayal, a cut deeper than any hard foul. The fallout was swift. The embraces were gone, replaced by silence. When the two men crossed paths, the air was heavy, the warmth of old photographs replaced by cold distance. Interviews from the time showed a bitterness neither could quite mask. Fans who had once marveled at their brotherhood now witnessed a fracture that seemed impossible to repair. For years, the two lived on opposite sides of a wound that refused to close. Then in 2017, in front of cameras, but also in front of millions of nostalgic fans, they finally sat down together. Tears welled up in Magic's eyes as he reached for Isiah's hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. Isiah, equally overcome, responded with emotion that had been bottled for decades. For a moment, time seemed to bend backward, and the friendship that once defined them flickered back into view. Yet even in reconciliation, the scar remained. For Isiah, Thomas Magic Johnson represented both the beauty of basketball friendships and the pain of losing them. Their story is not simply about rivalry on the court. It is about the fragile line between competition and companionship, and how sometimes the wounds of mistrust linger long after the final buzzer. Long before the battles with Chicago or Los Angeles, Isiah Thomas had to climb past Boston. And at the heart of those Celtic dynasties stood Larry Bird, the pride of Indiana, a man whose cool demeanor masked a burning competitiveness. Their encounters were more than basketball. They were cultural clashes, the Pistons clawing for recognition against a team that had been the standard of excellence throughout the 80s. In the 1987 Eastern Conference Finals, the tension reached its breaking point. Detroit had Boston on the ropes. Game 5 in the fabled Boston Garden was supposed to be their turning point. But with seconds left, a careless inbounds pass was stolen by Bird, who whipped the ball to Dennis Johnson for the winning basket. The Garden shook as fans erupted, and Isiah stood stunned. That single play became one of the most iconic highlights of the decade, and for Thomas, it was a scar. But the rivalry was not only about what happened on the hardwood. That same year, in the aftermath of a heated playoff battle, words were spoken that stirred a storm. Isiah was quoted, suggesting that Bird's legendary status was elevated because of the color of his skin. though Thomas later clarified, explaining he was echoing a sentiment in the locker room rather than voicing his own. The damage was done. Bird himself handled it with calm, dismissing the controversy, but the media frenzy left a lasting shadow. On the court, the clashes between Detroit and Boston were brutal. Elbows, hard screens, and relentless defense defined their matchups. Yet amid the chaos, there was also a grudging respect. Thomas admired Bird's poise and clutch shooting, even if he would never openly admit it during those years. Bird, for his part, recognized Isiah's leadership and skill, though the bitterness of their duels lingered. By the early 90s, the Celtics dynasty had faded, and Detroit's reign gave way to Chicago. But the memories of those Boston showdowns never disappeared. For Isiah, Larry Bird represented more than a rival. He was the obstacle that taught him both heartbreak and resilience. And while the words and the losses may have left wounds, they also carved out one of the defining rivalries of an era where every game felt like it carried the weight of history. Not every rivalry that haunted Isiah Thomas wore an opposing jersey. Sometimes the tension lived right inside the Pistons' own locker room. Few stories capture that truth better than his complicated relationship with Adrian Dantley. Dantley was a gifted scorer, a player with a smooth mid-range touch, and an instinct for getting to the free throw line. When he joined Detroit in the mid-'80s, many thought he would be the missing piece to push the Pistons over the top. And at first, the partnership worked. Dantley poured in points, Thomas orchestrated the offense, and together they made Detroit one of the most feared teams in the league. But success often magnifies differences. Dantley was older, proud, and protective of his role. Isiah, as captain, was equally protective of his authority. Rumors swirled that Dantley didn't always buy into the selfless bruising style that defined the bad boys. He wanted touches, he wanted recognition, and he sometimes clashed with the leadership voice of Thomas. In a locker room already filled with volatile personalities, even small disagreements could feel like cracks in the foundation. The breaking point came in 1989, right as the Pistons were chasing their first championship. Mid-season Detroit stunned the league by trading Dantley to Dallas for Mark Aguirre, a close friend of Isiah's. The move shocked fans and players alike. Dantley later suggested that Isiah had played a role in pushing for the trade, framing it as betrayal. Thomas denied it, insisting that management made the decision. But the whispers stuck. To this day, the perception that Isiah may have orchestrated his teammates' exit lingers in basketball lore. The aftermath was painful. Dantley, once central to Detroit's offense, watched from afar as the Pistons claimed back-to-back titles without him. For Thomas, the championships validated the decision, but they also carried the weight of a friendship lost. Whenever Dantley spoke about the Pistons in later years, his bitterness was clear. The rivalry was not about physical battles or playoff heartbreaks, but about trust that dissolved within the same locker room. For Isiah Thomas, Adrian Dantley was not an enemy across the court. He was a reminder that leadership sometimes demands sacrifices, and that those sacrifices can come with personal costs that never truly heal. Among all the names Isiah Thomas could never quite forgive, Dantley stands out as proof that even victory can leave behind unresolved scars. By the early 90s, the Pistons' reign was beginning to fade, but Isiah Thomas still carried himself with the fire of a champion. That fire was nearly extinguished one night in Salt Lake City when he crossed paths with Karl Malone. The mailman was known for his strength, his durability, and his punishing style of play. But in December of 1991, one collision between the two created an image that remains etched in NBA memory. Thomas drove the lane as he had done thousands of times before, weaving through defenders with his quick first step. Malone met him with a forearm that landed flush. Isiah crumpled to the floor, his forehead split open, blood staining the hardwood. He would later need over 40 stitches to close the wound. The sight was shocking, even in an era known for its physicality. For Thomas, it wasn't just another hard foul, it was a line crossed. The league responded with a suspension and fine for Malone, but no punishment could undo the scar, both physical and emotional that Thomas carried from that night. For a competitor as proud as Isiah, the injury felt less like an accident and more like an assault on his dignity. The moment became one of those memories that linger replayed in his mind, long after the stitches had healed. From then on, the relationship between the two men was fractured, if it ever truly existed. Malone continued to dominate for the Jazz, collecting MVPs and chasing a championship ring. Thomas, meanwhile, battled injuries and the decline of the Pistons. But whenever fans recalled that infamous elbow, the conversation always returned to the question of intent and whether the mailman had meant to leave such a brutal mark. Decades later, when clips of the incident resurface on highlight reels, the reaction is still visceral. Viewers gasp, players wince, and Thomas's scar remains a symbol of the era's unforgiving nature. For Isiah, Karl Malone was not a rival defined by playoff battles or championship races, but by a single, unforgettable blow. And among the grudges he could never quite forgive, the December night in Utah may have cut the deepest. Isiah Thomas's career will always be remembered for brilliance on the court and defiance off of it. He was the smiling assassin, a guard who could control the tempo of a game, lift his team to victory, and yet never back down from conflict. But as much as he was defined by championships and accolades, he was also defined by the rivalries that shaped his journey. Michael Jordan, who grew from nemesis to cultural icon, left a wound that still stings when old footage plays. Magic Johnson, once a brother in friendship, became a symbol of trust lost and only partly restored. Larry Bird, the Celtics legend, reminded Thomas of words that could never be unsaid and plays that could never be undone. Adrian Dantley, a teammate turned critic, proved that even inside a locker room loyalty could fracture. And Karl Malone, with one unforgettable elbow, etched his name into Thomas's story in the harshest way possible. Each rivalry was different, yet together they revealed the true essence of Isiah Thomas, a competitor who carried every slight, every scar, and every grudge as fuel. For some, those grudges may have weighed him down. For others, they made him unstoppable. They explain why his legacy still sparks debate. Was he the genius floor general who brought Detroit glory, or the controversial figure who left too many enemies behind? In the end, the answer may be both. And perhaps that duality is what makes him unforgettable. He played with skill, he led with heart, and he never forgot the names of those who stood in his way. So the question lingers, were those grudges a burden, or were they the very fire that made Isiah Thomas great?